This is the 22nd edition of the International AIDS Conference holding here in Amsterdam. Over 15,000 participants, including scientists, human rights activists, clinicians, and of course the media are all here to give a progress report about HIV and AIDS and how far the world has gone in its global fight against HIV and AIDS. Africa is well represented here, and one very important figure who's taking part in the conference is the First Lady of Namibia, and she has agreed graciously to speak with Alternative Africa on what she's doing relating to HIV and AIDS in her country and other things she's doing when we talk about AIDS. On Alternative Africa today, we have the pleasure and we're humbled to have Excellency, the First Lady of Namibia, Her Excellency Monica Geingos. You're welcome, Madam, and it's a pleasure to have you on Alternative Africa today.
Thank you.
As the UNAIDS Special Advocate for young women and adolescent girls, what has been your experience in Africa?
I'm glad you make that specification of in Africa, because the experience does differ from continent to continent, and it's really our responsibility as Africans to make sure that we address our very specific issues. So we need to look at the macro issues, especially around economic inequalities and how that relates to issues like HIV and specifically to adolescent girls and young women. In the African context, the further away that you go from the urban areas, so the further you move from Lagos or Abuja, the more extreme the situation becomes, because somehow these conferences that we have in cities like Amsterdam, they tend to stay with those who came from the urban areas, so the ones who go back to Abuja and Lagos, and that information and the data and the science doesn't filter through
It's lost
to those who really need it. So what has surprised me in the African context is how severe the problem is for the poor, rural, black female, and how we all have a responsibility to protect her more. Any society that doesn't protect its vulnerable speaks to what its values are. And the reality is a lot of the adults are not seeing poor rural girls as people in need of protection. They're seeing them as an easy target to have sex with in exchange for money or for material goods. They're seeing her as a form of cheap labor. They're seeing her as everything else except an adolescent girl who needs to be protected and who needs to be given an opportunity to live her potential. So we must change that thinking that we have towards the adolescent, the African adolescent girl and young woman.
Okay, so that brings us to the issue of the message. How can we get the message to be smarter? Because we know young girls of today, it's about talking coded, it's about a coded message, it's about signs, it's about, emojis. How can we get the message smarter, looking at our cultural way of life in Africa?
Yes, I think the message, it's a lot about trust. We need to build trust with our young people again. I think to an extent, the very behavior that we worried about in young people, where do they get it from? Who raised them? So they don't trust us anymore because we don't act in a way that they can trust us. We don't act in a way that they can follow our example. So I think if we want to fix the young person, we need to fix the adults. A lot of the harm and the thinking that is in young people now comes from what they see and what adults do to them. So I think that's the first part. So I think part of rebuilding our societies and reimagining our values has got a lot to do with reminding each other again as Africans, how do we parent effectively in the 21st century? What is expected from us as adults and what lessons are we transferring to our young people? The second part is issues of identity. I think the African youth have complexities around figuring out what exactly is our identity, because if you think about it, and I think about it from a Namibian perspective, where we had um, missionaries who first came, but they came with a very European context and they changed our cultures.
Yeah.
Then the colonizers came after them, and what they left behind is African culture, which is actually very Eurocentric in nature.
Yeah.
So we need to re-figure out what is our identity, what is our actual culture, because a lot of what we're sticking to is actually not ours. So there's the issues of identity, there's the issues of reimagining how adults should behave towards young people. And then there's the issue of language, as you say. Young people relate to one another differently. And we must accept that our teenagers, especially, aren't always going to tell us what they're going through. But they are going to tell somebody. And who is that somebody? It's probably a peer. So we must also go back to peer education. We must go back to surrounding our children with adults we can trust. We were all raised by an uncle, by a grandmother, by a neighbor, and that neighbor was trustworthy, that uncle was trustworthy, whereas now you don't even want to send your child to a neighbor's house because you don't know what's going to happen.
Exactly.
So we need to rebuild the trustworthy male adult in the lives of our children who does not expose them to further harm. And we trust each other again as people who can take care of one another's children, regardless.
Okay, talking about trust, let's look at the Organization of First Ladies of Africa Against AIDS. What is the role when it comes to trust? How are you coming together?
So I think the Organization of African First Ladies is going through a process where we are re-evaluating who and what we are, starting with a name. So according to the AU's Agenda 2063, we're talking about more female participation in politics at every level. That should assume that should be at the level of head of states as well. With Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who stepped down, we don't have an African leader anymore who's female. So we have to ask ourselves, if we're going to push for the political participation of women at all levels, then surely the name African First Ladies is maybe a misnomer. Because we should be able to have a female head of state who is likely to have a husband, and this poor guy must now come sit here with African First Ladies. He's a spouse, and so are we. So we are having this conversation about, do we need a change of name, do we need a change of focus, and how do we make an impact in the issues that matter. But again, it's not as mothers or grandmothers, it's as spouses, and within the limitation of those roles. And as you will know, how and what you believe and think about cannot exist in isolation to the political culture of your country. So if I come from a very conservative country, very religious, there's certain things that are going to be very uncomfortable for you to speak about as an African First Lady. And it may be possible for another First Lady to speak about it.
Do you think it's working against us as Africans because we have different cultures within the African setting? Or what works for maybe Namibia may not necessarily work for Nigeria, or what works for Nigeria may not work for Ghana or Zimbabwe?
Yes.
Are we actually united to actually fight HIV and AIDS?
I think we need to fight HIV and AIDS within our respective continents. So I think there's different fights on different levels. There's the fight of, are we united or are we regionalized? Is there Lusophone Africa, is there Francophone Africa, is there Arabia? And the answer is probably yes. But we must also remember as Africans, and it's something that Nyerere said, which I agree with, that once we leave the continent, nobody cares about our Nigerianness or my Namibianness or your Tanzanianness. All they see is an African. So there's no point in me saying, yes, Nigeria is not doing a great job, because when I come here to the Netherlands, the Nigerians and Namibians both have green passports.
No one cares.
It's an African. So we need to learn to speak for the African context of the continent, and within the continent we address these kind of issues. It's like in your own home. If you and your children and your husband disagree, do you go outside and tell all the neighbors, yeah, we're disagreeing in that house, nobody understands each other, it's terrible? No. You deal with what's internally, but outside you speak for the family. So we are a family, and we must know when we speak what.
Okay, looking at the UNICEF report, it's women at the heart of the HIV response for children, and there's something about adolescents there. Now, as a mother, what's your worry? Because we know that this day and age, we have a lot of asylum seekers. Young girls don't care anymore. They want to travel to big countries, to the USA, to the United Kingdom, to maybe Australia, and according to them, go for the greener pastures. Now, what can we tell such a girl that, look, what you're looking for is right in your country? Because as asylum seekers, they become vulnerable because they will do anything to cross the borders.
Yes. We can't have this conversation without looking at the push factors. We can't have this conversation without saying, what is it that is so bad that young people are willing to literally risk the waters and their lives to find that greener pasture there and resolve that? And it's normally socioeconomic issues. So if she believes, and most of these young people know exactly the risks that they're facing, but they seem to think that it's worth that risk. And to me, what we're missing is we need to give our young people hope that they can build livelihoods in their own countries. We also need to give them the confidence that if they do the right things, they can build livelihoods. It's not about which tribe you're from, it doesn't matter which region you're from within your country, you have access to fair opportunity. And if you get that right, and that's a governance and leadership issue. And then the third part is really to say, if all our young people go to school, they get educated, we ensure that the governance and the leadership is right and they have access to fair opportunity, is there opportunity? Are our economy structured in a way to absorb young people into gainful employment, and give them the dignity that they deserve? So it's about hope, it's about access to fair opportunity, but it's also about re-looking our socio-economic structures and making sure that they are representative of the African demographic in country.
Okay, I see you as a participant right now at the International AIDS Conference in Amsterdam. What are you taking back home?
So a global agenda has been set, but there must be a domestic agenda as well. And it's difficult to enforce your domestic agenda if you are not channeling your own resources. So I think we must follow the AU guidelines about how much we are supposed to spend relative to our GDP on education, on health, and our HIV responses. That allows us to welcome donors and allow them to be helpful where we require them. At the moment, it's the other way around, where a lot of our health response is funded a lot by donor funding, and it has to follow who pays the piper. It has to follow the demands of donors. I think the other thing that we need to get right is there's a lot of scientific data available at the moment, which has got very exciting developments in relation to the science behind HIV. But HIV as a virus, it's not only a scientific issue, it's also a social issue. So the science collides with socioeconomic realities. And we somehow need to marry those two and bring them closer. So we can get the science right, but it's not just biomedical that is important. We also need to get the socioeconomic circumstances right. So we can, for instance, ensure that babies are no longer born with HIV by giving the right care to mothers. So these children are starting free of HIV, but then they go and contract HIV between the age of 14 to 24. So we need to continue that protection in an age-appropriate way so that they stay free of HIV, not just start free of HIV. So what is happening in that phase where they are being exposed to HIV between the age of 14 to 24? So we need to redouble our efforts to adolescent girls and young women and save them from the socioeconomic realities that forces them to be exposed to HIV.
In 2019, the African version of the International AIDS Conference will be taking place. What are you hoping for?
I'm hoping for, I think these kind of conferences are exceptionally useful. They have powerful messages and you realize just how big the HIV community is. There's so many, there's LGBT, there's youth, there's the scientific community, there's everybody is here. And it's powerful messaging because you start to learn things that you didn't know, even if they don't apply in your countries. But from the African context, I think what I'm hoping for is, at the moment, we are preaching to the converted. Everybody here is of the same view that we need to move beyond rhetoric, and there is urgency required in how we address HIV. We're speaking to one another, we all agree. We need to get more of those who we believe may be responsible for the bottlenecks. So we need to draw in more, and I'm not saying it's them who's responsible for the bottlenecks, but we need to have more religious leaders, traditional leaders. We need to have more policy makers, but most importantly, we need to have the implementers. So whether it's the teachers who teach comprehensive sexual education in schools, whether it's the police officers who are dealing with youth, whether the people who are closest to the fire should come and listen to some of these conversations, so when they go back to implement, they know exactly what the benchmarks are, as opposed to us, who go back to our urban homes and don't allow the information to filter through to where it matters. And then the second part, sorry to interrupt, is I hope that the saving that we have by having some of these conferences in Africa, we're able to fund the activists who come here and the grassroots organizations who come here. Because there's no point being willing to pay for the flight ticket of a grassroots organization leader to come to Amsterdam, but when that same person asks for the same amount of money in order to implement a program in their village where they come from, the answer is no. So I hope we do start marrying that. If somebody qualifies to come here for this type of event, they should qualify for it.
So world leaders need to put that funding down to fund HIV and AIDS?
At grassroots level, by the people who champion the causes.
Now, on a final note, what's your message to policymakers? You've talked about the funding, but finally now, policymakers, world leaders, African leaders, because we know at least 99% of them are men. What's your message to them?
Listen, I'm very clear. Because I'm a first lady, it's a very delicate situation. I don't give advice to policymakers. I'm married to one. And it's as far as it goes. But I think the message is listen, translate, and implement. You don't have to be a woman to advocate for right policies for women. You don't have to be a child in order to do the right things for children. So to me, it doesn't matter that it's primarily men. It has to reflect female leadership as well, but for the men who are there now. Because in the future we'll probably have more female African leaders, but right now we have 100% male. And right now, all we need them to do is to listen, translate, and implement.
So let's look at your pet project in Namibia.
Yes.
Yeah, what's it all about?
So it's called the One Economy Foundation. And where that name comes from is in recognition that in most African countries we have two economies in one country. The first economy is first world. You go to the best schools in Nigeria, you have access to the best healthcare, you speak great English, you get on a flight when you feel like it, and within 6 hours you are in London. And you have great holidays, and you have actually access to a first world life in Nigeria. Then there's a second economy, which is the exact opposite. You speak pidgin, you're not living in urban centers, you don't have access to a plane that carries you to London in 6 hours and allows you to do shopping, and you don't have access to private jets. Now the second economy is where most of us are, or most of our people are. The first economy is enjoyed by very few.
Exclusive.
It's very exclusive. And if we want to sustain the structural integrity of our societies, we need one economy. We need more people participating in the first economy. And that's why we speak about one economy. It's an aspirational shout of what has to happen in bringing our economies closer together in country. So what we do as One Economy is we run programs that basically break whatever holds people back. So before we implement a project, we first ask, well, let's sustainably remove this person from poverty. So one of our most important projects is what we call the One Nation Fund. And the One Nation Fund is a collateral-free lending program where we lend to people in the second economy, because one thing that they do not have is collateral. So the formal financial institutions do not give them lending for their business.
So is it a form of cooperative thing?
It's not really. It's not really. It really provides exceptionally cheap funding to entrepreneurs who will not, a woman who sell at the market, they will simply never qualify for bank funding, number one.
Exactly.
So we help them. But the second part, bank funding can also be expensive. So it's exceptionally cheap, it's not exploitative, especially on the microloan side, not the traditional funding. And then on the third part, we simplify them to terms that she can understand. We give free entrepreneurial training, and we integrate this with all of our other programs. Then we run other programs in terms of GBV. Then we've got the Be Free project, which I personally love, which is really about running platforms for young people where they can speak about the issues that are important to them on non-judgmental platforms. After they've spoken, we connect them, so it's an intergenerational dialogue between parents, young people, and service providers to young people. So we bring in owners of nightclubs, we bring in police officers, social workers, psychologists, we bring in teachers, we bring in the full spectrum of
Sounds
people.
like you're bringing in everybody.
We bring in everybody, and why that's important. I can't start a conversation about past trauma around sexual violence, and I don't know if you've had that experience or not. And once I've opened up that wound again, how do I access you to service? Do I just scratch the wound open and leave you? Or do I link you to the appropriate service so that you can unpack the harm that was caused by past untreated trauma? So we're very mindful of that. So part of having the difficult discussion is also allowing young people to access services. And then the third part is, if young people mention something that's very important from a policy perspective, who takes that conversation further? So we take that responsibility upon ourselves. So it's not just a conversation, it actually goes into meaningful action. And it's been very popular. It also allows us to change the national conversation on a topic, on difficult topics. So I personally enjoy that a lot.
So there's been a positive feedback?
There's been very positive feedback. Sometimes there's negative feedback. I mean, you're not going to talk about the age at which young people start to have sex and alcohol and drugs, and nobody's going to say anything. But I think that's the role of first ladies. I think we have lots of unearned privilege, simply because we married men who became presidents. There you become a first lady, you excellency, you're a great person all of a sudden in society. So when you have privilege of any kind, it comes with a responsibility. And what I see as my responsibility is I've got lots of unearned social capital. And with anything that's unearned of a capital nature, you must spend it. So I spend part of my social capital addressing difficult topics, having difficult conversations. So when people do criticize some of the activities that we run with young people, I see it as a necessary, it's part of the expenditure of my capital in order to build societies. So I see it as a responsibility that comes with unearned privilege.
Issues of disability and mental health.
Yes.
Especially mental health, it's not something we talk about. You know, it's a taboo to say you've got mental health issues. And it's because there's a lot of pressure on young people now. They're beginning to get mental health issues. What's been your experience like in dealing with it, maybe in your country?
Yes. So mental health is a critical point, and to the point where I think we even need to incorporate it more in the HIV response, because the depression, the anxiety, the self-doubt that comes with living with HIV, it's debilitating to some people to the point where they get off treatment. Mental health generally in young people or in the African context is something that we need to be more honest and open about. We kind of have this thing where if somebody goes to mental health assistance, they're weak or they've been bewitched and they don't understand, and let's rather go to the village and go to the old man so he can fix you. So we need to have much more clear conversations around mental health, because again, if my child has mental health challenges, the likelihood that I'm going to send him to a psychologist is high. Whereas in the village, if my cousin, whose parents don't have money and access, have a child who's showing signs of depression, he's likely to be taken to a witch doctor. So we must start to identify what constitutes these mental health challenges. And we do incorporate it into Be Free. That's why we always have social workers and psychologists who are part of our engagements. The issues of disability is harder. One Economy Foundation already has a very wide focus. And the wider your focus, the less impact you'll make if you're all over the place. So there's lots of issues that bother me. Disability being one, but we cannot be everything to everybody. So if we have a young person who has a mental health challenge, they're an adolescent and they're disabled, we're certainly not going to turn them away. They will be part of what we respond to. We do try and make a conscious effort to bring young people who have physical challenges within our programs. We do make an intentional effort. But do we have a program that specifically looks at disability? We don't. We don't have the capacity, we don't have the resources. All we can do properly is to incorporate them in all of our programs and make sure that they're accessible to young people with disability. But mental health certainly is worked into our programs around adolescents.
You seem to have a pet project that is so integrated, so encompassing and intimidating to some people who may want to do something similar to you.
Yes.
Now, when you leave as First Lady, because
Yes.
the problem with pet projects from the First Lady or some, government organizations within the government is that there's no continuity.
Yes.
So, when you leave as First Lady, how would people still be able to benefit from your project?
So before I became First Lady, and I think that's an important question, because it's something that we continuously ask ourselves, are we making people reliant on services that one day we can't afford to continue? So it's important here to mention that before I became First Lady, I ran and owned a private equity fund for over 14 years. It continues to be the largest private equity fund in Namibia. We did asset declarations with my husband, and I've significantly downscaled my business interests because I'm a First Lady. And I've thrown all of my effort into the One Economy Foundation, exactly because I want sustainability. My name is Monica Geingos. It's called One Economy and not Monica Geingos, because it's not about me. To me, it's a foundation that must continue its work.
After you leave as First Lady?
After I leave as First Lady. That's the first thing. So what we've done is we've structured our programs around sustainability. We've also structured how we seek and retain funding in a way that is long-term. And sometimes we who are privileged must also learn to put our money where our mouths are. So from a personal perspective, my children know this, they are not inheriting from me. If they're lucky, they're going to inherit my sass and my confidence. But they're not inheriting my money.
Why?
What I don't spend, I'm going to spend in One Economy Foundation. Because we must stop talking about inequality and not be willing to put the resources behind the things that we talk about.
Yes.
So I think if more people who are wealthy actually started putting their money towards those who are not, especially in our countries where there's these huge income inequalities, we may ourselves be able to change these things. So my estate at the moment goes to One Economy Foundation, and the money that I have available for these type of things, I put directly into the One Economy Foundation as well. So I've put my money where my mouth is. So it's not just a passion while I'm First Lady. It's an ongoing passion that will live. It will be stronger when I pass. And this is why Africans don't tell their kids they're inheriting, because they'll kill you. So One Economy Foundation luckily isn't a person, it can't kill me, but it will be more financially stable the day that I pass.
Honestly, it's a pleasure talking to you. I know we can go we can go on and on, because for everything you say, something else is just there. And your source of inspiration, actually, I'm really inspired by you, honestly. Well, we can go on and on, but we just have to stop.
Thank you.
On Time of Africa today, I've been talking with Her Excellency, the First Lady of Namibia, who also happens to be UNAIDS Special Advocate for Young Women and Adolescent Girls. It's a pleasure, Your Excellency.
Thank you.
And I'm really, really honored to have been able to speak to you on behalf of Vitality of Africa. Thank you.
Thank you for